Okay, so this is going to be an audio recording which will accompany an excerpt from William Shire's book, Rise and Fall of the Third Reich. The chapter is titled The Last Days of the Republic, pages 133 to 167. And the purpose of this audio recording is to give an easier explanation than the pages of text because the language is kind of convoluted and extremely complicated. Nonetheless, going over the text is extremely important. However, it's probably extremely helpful to students that there's a recording to accompany the text. It's probably a little bit easier to understand with the audio explanation. So the purpose of understanding what's going on in these pages is because in the International Baccalaureate program, the curriculum demands that students have a very strong understanding of leaders' rise to power. And of course, if we're talking about Hitler, which is one of the leaders that is instructed at the American School of Tegucigalpa in the senior year, we're talking about all events prior to January 30th, 1933, meaning that if there's a test question that asks students to assess Hitler's rise to power, only events that are prior to January 30th, 1933 are going to be awarded with credit. Any event that comes during the period which would be called his consolidation of power, such as the Reichstag fire in 1933, I believe, and the Night of Long Knives in 1934, and really a number of other events that take place throughout the later 30s, these would not count because they are after January 30th, 1933. So the advantage of this section, these pages in Rise and Fall of the Third Reich by William Schreier, pages 133 to 167, is that they give a very extensive, detailed explanation of the conditions and the methods that allowed Hitler to rise to power. So there's a bunch of reasons why this was chosen, and I believe I've explained why I've chosen this excerpt to be the one that I will give to students. And there's a bunch of ways that I've made it easier. This audio recording is one way that's easier, and also the notes that I have taken and scanned, which accompany the reading, are another way to also make it easier. So we're going to kind of go through it, and I'm going to kind of go through it in a format that follows the notes that I have. So if a student really wanted to have a concrete understanding during this audio recording, they could also maybe display their notes on the screen, the notes that I've taken, or perhaps even any notes of their own. Now, the first thing that I'm going to talk about before I actually go into the details of the section, which is, again, pages 133 to 167, is that there are a number of long-term causes for Hitler's rise to power that are actually not mentioned in this reading. Or if they are mentioned, they're kind of very briefly mentioned and not given a full explanation. So one of these causes is, of course, the unfairness of the Versailles Treaty, the treaty that ended World War I. This Versailles Treaty took land away from Germany. It forced Germany to pay reparations to the other powers, namely France. It also resulted in parts of Germany being occupied by the French in order to extract those reparations, so areas such as the Ruhr in western Germany. So the unfairness of Versailles and the stab in the back betrayal, or the stab in the back myth, the belief that basically German soldiers could have kept fighting and that politicians betrayed them by signing the armistice on November 11th, this is not really mentioned. Definitely it is one of the reasons, one of the conditions that helps Hitler rise to power, though. Furthermore, the section does get at a lot of the weaknesses in the Weimar Republic, and it's really good for the period, 1930 to 33, but it doesn't get at a lot of the other weaknesses of the Weimar Republic, such as in Ian Kershaw's book, The Hitler Myth. There is extensively mentioned the belief that the Germans have that they need a strong leader to actually take command, and this kind of inherent criticism of democracy, that basically democracy just doesn't work, it's endless talking, it's endless deliberation, nothing ever gets done. This critical judgment of the Weimar Republic is not fully fleshed out in William Schreier's book. And also, there's Article 48, which is mentioned in the beginning of the section, but not fully described. Article 48 allows the Chancellor to dissolve the Reichstag. And of course, in the section, in the pages, the Reichstag is dissolved many, many times. And what this really shows is a lack of balance of powers in the German government, because the chancellor, which would be part of the executive branch, has really an imbalanced amount of power over the legislative branch, which would be the Reichstag. Now, what details kind of do come out in the section is that, there's the Great Depression, and in the first few pages, what happens is the reading shows the voting difference between 1928 and 1930 for the Nazi Party. And what the reader can observe is that there's a huge jump in supporters for the Nazi Party. In fact, in 1928, we can see here, it's on the first page of the notes, there's only 800,000 people that vote for the Nazi Party. But then merely 2 years later, in 1930, 6.5 million people vote for the Nazi Party. And one of the big reasons that there is that difference is because, of course, in 1929, there is the Great Depression. And what the Great Depression does in Germany is it creates a large amount of unemployed people. And, lots of these young men who now don't have jobs, they want, to improve their lot. They want to improve their life, and one of the things that they can do is becoming involved in politics. And a lot of these young men, what they do is they join the SA, or the Brown Shirts, which are an element of the Nazi Party, and they kind of go and cause trouble in the streets. They beat up communists. They blame the Jews. They blame Republican politicians, members of the Weimar Republic, for the failures and hard times in Germany. And basically, one of the big conditions that allows the Nazi Party to flourish is the Great Depression. Because without all those unemployed Germans, there would not be all these members joining the SA. And if there were not all these members joining the SA, then the Nazi Party would not have all these followers that it could use to send into the streets, to cause disturbances, to beat up the communists, etc. So the Great Depression is a direct cause, short-term cause, that allows Hitler to rise into power between the years 29 and 33, really. And another condition, which is kind of played out in the reading, is that there is a constant lack of a political majority. Basically, there's three major parties during this time period in Germany between the years 1930 and 1933. The major parties are the Social Democrats, which are kind of a left-center party, a little bit of a socialist party, but kind of like the Democrats today in the United States. Then there's the Communist Party, which are kind of self-explanatory. They are indeed communists. And then there's the Nazi Party. So what ends up happening is these are the three big parties which dominate the Reichstag, but none of them is really able to get a majority in the Reichstag. And of course, in a parliamentary government, if there is not a majority, laws cannot be passed. So this constant lack of any party or single leader to create a majority in the Reichstag is one of the specific reasons in which the Weimar Republic is a weak form of government. So those are some of the brief causes. I'll just go over them again. We've got the Versailles Treaty and the unfair conditions. We've got basically the lack of a good functioning republic. It's in its infancy. It's the first time Germany's ever experimenting with a republic. Prior to the republic, of course, they had the Kaiser, which is a monarchy. So they don't have a lot of respect for really democratic traditions, and they certainly don't have a long history experiencing them. Also, Article 48 was another reason, and then, of course, the short-term causes are the lack of a political majority and the Great Depression. So now what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to start going through these notes that I've scanned and digitized, and it looks like I've created 8 different pages, and I'm not going to go through it line by line because, of course, I am aware that all of the people who would listen to this can read for themselves, but I'll kind of highlight some of the features in the notes that are worth looking at. So we see that one of the first things that's mentioned in the notes is Kuhhandel, which is, it's written there, cattle trading and worthless republic. And what this means is that this is the term that the Germans gave in the 1930s to the Weimar Republic, which was governing them. Basically, throughout the 20s, the Germans became increasingly disillusioned and unsatisfied with the government that they had because they were suffering under the reparations that they had to pay to the victors of World War I and the constant failure of any political party to produce a majority and actually pass legislation that would help Germans and get them out of unemployment that they were now suffering from the Depression in 29. Basically, Germans are just becoming furious with their government, and they believe that these representatives in the Reichstag, they're they're meaningless. It's meaningless who serves in the Reichstag. Article 48 I've already covered, and we can see that there are some names that are underlined here, and we can see that there's Schleicher, who's definitely maybe the second most important man to know in Hitler's rise to power outside of Hitler himself. Because the way that William Schreier sets this up is that there's essentially a few different greedy, power-hungry people in Germany at the time, between the years 1930 and 1933, that are essentially battling with each other for power. And Schleicher is definitely one of these power-hungry guys. And, of course, Hitler would be the other one. And the reason that Hitler is able to rise to power is basically because these guys are so effective at tearing each other apart. If Schleicher and Brüning, for example, had allied against Hitler, it's very possible that Hitler would have never been able to rise to power. But basically, the names of a lot of these guys appear because they were chancellors during this period. Basically, there's three important chancellors to know between the years 1930 and 1933. The first important chancellor to know is Brüning. The second important chancellor to know is... actually, no, I'm sorry, there's four. The first important one to know is Brüning. He's fairly important. After Brüning, there's von Papen. And after von Papen, there's Schleicher. And after Schleicher, you have Hitler. So there's kind of this transition in power where Brüning comes first, and he actually holds the chancellorship for a decent amount of time. And then after he is essentially removed because Hindenburg loses faith in him, we see von Papen rise to power, who's a very weak leader. And after von Papen is in power for a few months, then Schleicher rises to power, and he's only there for, I think, 57 days, something very short. And after him, we have Hitler. So a lot of the details that are kind of explained in detail in the notes go through the reign or the rule of these different chancellors in the years 1930 to 1933. So, it's important to understand who the chancellor is. In Germany, the position chancellor is part of the executive branch. It accompanies the president. So you'd have the president, and who's going to be Hindenburg for the whole time in these years 1930 to 1933. And then you have the four different chancellors, which I've named, starting with Brüning, going on to von Papen, going on to Schleicher, and then finally Hitler. So basically what we see is due to the rise in popularity in 1930, when Brüning is chancellor, the Nazis start winning a lot of positions in the Reichstag and in other local government offices in 1930. So they're actually starting to be talked to by major politicians who are seeking to form the Golden Coalition, essentially a coalition that could actually pass laws and get things done in the weak Weimar Republic. So the first guy who's actually trying to put all these pieces together is Brüning. And this guy is maybe the most qualified politician out of the four, who are, again, Brüning, von Papen, Schleicher, and Hitler. However, he is also the most unpopular. Usually this is kind of how it works in politics. People who can actually get things done and have the knowledge are not so good at charisma or public relations. So we can see that Brüning has two basic goals to essentially installing order in Germany. He wants to extend Hindenburg's presidency. Hindenburg, of course, himself a World War I hero, a former general. Or he wants to reinstate the monarchy, which is essentially to go back in time. So Brüning is kind of a reactionary. However, Brüning is completely unable to convince anyone to reinstall the monarchy. Hindenburg, of course, he himself, being president at this time, doesn't favor the idea at all. He was actually the one who told Kaiser Wilhelm that it was necessary for him to step down and abdicate the throne. So the installation of the monarchy is completely impossible. So basically he's left to trying to extend Hindenburg's presidency and convince Hindenburg that it's extremely important that Hindenburg remains in the position of president. Basically because if Hindenburg does not, then it's going to be even more difficult for any political leader to create a majority in the Reichstag. So afterwards, we've got a campaign. It appears really early on. It's on the second page of the notes. We can see that there's a presidential election. We see that in 1932, Hitler decides to run for president, and he's running against Hindenburg, who of course is the World War I hero. And the first round of elections happens in March 1932, and neither candidate gains a majority. Now this is astronomical for Hitler. This election in March 1932 is really his first big attempt to attain an office of high power. And as you can see, he doesn't win because Hindenburg has more votes than Hitler, which means that it has to go to another round of election. This is still astronomical because before this election, Hitler had not really appeared on the map. He was, of course, the leader of the party, which had 6.5 million followers, but he never had participated in any large national election. So this is huge. So then, as you can see, there's a second round, and Hitler still loses, but he collects even more votes. You can see his votes increasing from 30% to 36%. So Hitler is doing pretty well in April 1932. He's trying, obviously, to have the legal rise to power. He's not trying to seize force like he did in his 1923 Munich beer hall putsch. He's using legal avenues, and he's seeing increasing returns because, of course, in 1928 he's only got 800,000 followers. In 1930 he's got 6.5 million. In 1932, now he's collecting 30% of the vote. And in the second round, April 1932, he's collecting 36% of the vote. And I don't have the numbers on the notes here, but from what I recall, I believe that 36% of the vote ends up to being something like 11 million followers. So this is an astronomical level of support that he's experiencing. And essentially, Hitler loses in April 1932, so Hindenburg stays in the presidency. However, Hitler is still part of the power dynamics. Now, there's some rumors after the April 1932 election that Hindenburg wins that if Hitler took power, if he won the election, the SA would be used as basically an organization to conduct a coup and remove the Reichstag and use this wave of support to actually thrust the Nazis into power completely, replacing all dimensions of government, the judiciary, and the legislature. But, the notes kind of make it clear that the government, and Schleicher in particular, became aware of this kind of conspiracy that the Nazis were not even really doing, or at least Hitler wasn't doing it. Maybe Rome, the leader of the SA, was doing it, but Hitler definitely didn't do it. And what the government tries to do is they try to ban the SA. They ban membership in the SA, which of course, again, is the brown shirts, the basically rough and tough group that demonstrates in the street and really attacks communists. That's the element. The SA is that element of the Nazi Party. So this is really a crucial point because Hitler lost this election in 1932, and what we're seeing happen is the government's cracking down on membership in the SA, which is an element of the Nazi Party. Now here is where Schleicher actually tries to get support from Rome, which is a member of the Nazi Party, and Hitler himself. So Schleicher is actually not participating in the crackdown on the Nazi Party. And the reason that Schleicher is doing this is, of course, because he believes if he himself can get the support of the Nazi Party, he might be able to one day be chancellor himself. And at this time, Schleicher is not chancellor. He has a different position in government, and he definitely has his eye on the future. That's why Schleicher is such an important guy, is because Schleicher fails to act in limiting the power of the Nazi Party, and because Schleicher fails to act, the Nazis are eventually rise to power. This is one specific example. So this is one. And it says there's that quote from Schreier, which I thought was really important down there. It says, "Already it is clear Schleicher and Hitler believe that they can get the best of one another." Schleicher believes that he's going to be able to use Hitler to make a majority in the Reichstag and become chancellor himself, and Hitler believes that he's going to be able to use Schleicher to remove the ban on the SA. So as we can keep going through the notes, we can see that Brüning is experiencing kind of more and more trouble. He's losing the support of Hindenburg, and we can see that Schleicher's now, the conspiracy is kind of being bore out. He has this three-part plan. The first part is that he's going to remove the ban on the SA. He's going to allow Hindenburg to make a new cabinet, and he's going to dissolve the Reichstag. So essentially, Brüning loses the faith of Hindenburg because Brüning is unable to make a majority in the Reichstag. He only has the support of the Social Democrats. The Communists and the Nazis don't support him at all. So after Brüning, it says, von Papen comes into power, and he, like I said previously, not really very talented, not a strong character, not someone who's cut out for leadership, especially not in this era where there's so many powerful personalities competing for power. He's a very timid, kind of shy and quiet guy who's really not going to be able to rise above the rabble. And we can see that in June 1932, due to the kind of conspiring between Schleicher and Hitler, there is a removal of the ban on the SA in June of 1932. So obviously then what happens is the SA goes back into the streets, they're fighting with communists, there's record levels of violence. This makes von Papen's government look extremely bad because there's all this disorder, and of course the first thing that a government is supposed to be able to do is install order and prevent violence. So we can see our elections again in July of 32. And we can see, I wrote down the numbers of how many seats, which means positions, chairs, right? There are in the Reichstag, there's 608. And we can see that the Nazis have the majority at 230 seats, the Social Democrats behind them at 133, and the Communists at 89. So this is kind of this is in concrete numbers what I'm referring to when I mean that no party has an absolute majority. No party can get to 50% of the seats, which would be 304. You can see that parties need to negotiate between themselves to try and get to the half. And ultimately what ends up happening is that the Nazis are able to draw on some of the support of the Catholic Center and some other small parties to propose that they can get 50%. Because between the Nazis, the Social Democrats, and the Communists, there's no negotiation. They are completely at odds with each other. The Nazis, a very right-wing group, of course. The Social Democrats, an actual legitimate democratic group, really in the ideological center. And then the Communists, of course, very far on the left, completely uncompromising. So we can keep going through the notes, and we see that by August, Hitler believes that he can kind of get what he wants from Schleicher and maybe rise to power. He knows that von Papen is falling out of power, and Hitler believes that this might be his chance to actually rise to power. So he goes to Schleicher, and Hitler says, make me the chancellor, and give the Nazis control of crucial ministries. And Hitler, of course, kind of tries to flatter Schleicher with a minister position in his possible government, should Schleicher help set him up. Now, here Schleicher is listening to Hitler's demands, and Schleicher's like, whoa, this is crazy. Because, of course, Schleicher himself wants to be chancellor. He doesn't want to install Hitler to the chancellorship. That doesn't make any sense. But Schleicher definitely would be willing to have Hitler be vice chancellor, which is a position similar to vice president, under the authority of the chancellor. But Hitler demands that he will only accept the chancellorship. And he goes to meet with Hindenburg, and Hindenburg doesn't like Hitler either. So we can see that here in August 1932, Hitler's popular with the German people, but he doesn't have a majority, and he doesn't have enough leverage with Schleicher or Hindenburg to get himself into power. And there's a debate inside the Nazi Party at this time, which Schreier writes extensively on, about whether the Nazis should continue to try the legal path or whether they should use force. And what Hitler decides is that he's going to continue to use the legal path and this kind of tricky power negotiation strategy with Schleicher and Papen. He believes that he's going to be able to do these backroom deals in order to install himself into power. And ultimately he's correct. He's able to do that. And he will become chancellor in the June 30th, 1933. So as we can see written here, the Nazis begin to kind of draw on the support of the Catholic Center. And one of the things that the Nazis do is they kind of, they say to the Catholic Church that they can actually protect them from the communists. Communists are, of course, atheists. And as was done in Russia, when the communists came to power, they actually persecuted the church. So the church definitely does not like the Communist Party, and the church is kind of, liking these promises that the Nazis are making. Of course, they'll be regretting it later on, during the consolidation of power and getting into Hitler's domestic policy, we can see that he will later on, in the later 30s, persecute the church. But here, before he's in power, Hitler is saying that he will protect the church from the communists. So, what ends up happening here is that Papen is continuing throughout 1932 to basically not be able to put together a majority in the Reichstag. So Papen dissolves the Reichstag again, and there's elections in 1932 in November. And now here we can see that they're basically the same as the elections just a few months before the elections in July 1932. You can see that the Nazis are still the largest party at 196 seats, and still it's going to be very hard to get to the magical number of 304, which would be 50% in the Reichstag. So, here the Nazis are a little bit nervous because they're getting slightly less seats. They're again kind of questioning, should we continue the legal route to power? Should we try and take it by force? Hitler sticks with it. He's like, I'm going to stick to the legal path. I'm going to keep this negotiation going on. Schleicher says, hey, Papen, look at these Reichstag votes. You're not going to be able to make a majority. And ultimately, Papen steps down. And there's kind of this decision that Hindenburg has to make. Hindenburg's really important in this whole process also, but he himself is not looking for absolute power at all. He's just looking for a chancellor who can actually piece together the legislative branch, which again is the Reichstag, and actually make laws be passed. So Hindenburg is now faced with a choice. Hindenburg can either choose Hitler to be the next chancellor after von Papen, or Hindenburg can choose Schleicher. And, you can see that Hindenburg, he offers Hitler the chancellorship if the Reichstag can get a majority. But here Hitler can't quite get it. He's not able to quite piece it together between the minor nationalist parties, the Catholic Center Party, and there's another nationalist party, its name is really too much to know. So here Schleicher finally sees his opportunity. Schleicher sees, okay, now it's my turn. Now, I undermined Brüning, I undermined Papen. Now is my time to be the chancellor. And Schleicher claims to Hindenburg that you should choose me because I can put it all together. So as we can see, December, there it is. Papen goes down, and Schleicher becomes chancellor. Now, what Schleicher tries to do is he tries to draw on the support of part of the Nazi Party to build this majority in the Reichstag. Because inside of the Nazi Party, there's people that are kind of closer to Hitler and that are true fascists, and then there's kind of left-wing Nazis, which you could almost call true socialists. These would be represented by the man called Strasser, and his name is underlined here. And Schleicher tries to get Strasser's support and the support of the Nazi members who would be in the political left in order to build this majority. That's kind of his idea, is that if he can grab some Nazis and use the support of the Social Democrats, he'll be able to produce the majority. But unfortunately, even though Schleicher is trying to bait or tempt Strasser with this position of the vice-chancellorship, Strasser doesn't want to do it. He sees that it would be a treachery to Hitler and the Nazi Party. And what Strasser wants to do is go and talk to Hitler about the use of force in trying to attain government, because Strasser doesn't believe that that Hitler and the Nazis can use the legal path anymore. He doesn't see it being possible to put together this coalition. And there's a vote, and the two different sides fall as they are there, and basically Schleicher's government rises to power. Strasser wants to tolerate the government and maybe move towards using force to overthrow it. And we've got the other three guys, Goebbels, Göring, and Hitler, who vehemently oppose Schleicher's government, and they will refuse to be part of the constructing the majority. So because of this ideological disagreement in the Nazi Party, basically Strasser resigns from the party. Now this is really bad because Hitler thinks that Strasser might actually use his influence in the Nazi Party to lend all that support to Schleicher. But Hitler's kind of lucky here because Strasser just disappears and goes on vacation. And what that allows Hitler to do is consolidate his power over the party. So ultimately, because Strasser doesn't join with Schleicher, Schleicher cannot build the majority that he promised Hindenburg. So this allows Hitler now to appear like the only man who can build the political majority in Germany, in the Reichstag again, right? Because the only reason that Hindenburg chose Schleicher to be chancellor in December of 1932 is because Hindenburg believed Schleicher could build this majority. But now December ends and we're moving into January, and it looks like it's impossible. It looks like Schleicher can't do it. So now Hitler, colluding with Papen, go to Hindenburg and they say that they can construct the majority in the Reichstag. So now Schleicher is seeing himself as kind of backstabbed by Papen and backstabbed by Hitler, and ultimately Hitler even draws in the support of Hindenburg's son, Oskar von Hindenburg, and with Hitler having the support of Papen and Hitler having the support of Oskar von Hindenburg, and then Schleicher's policy kind of leaning towards the communists, kind of threatening industrialists and business forces in Germany, Hindenburg is feeling a lot of pressure to remove Schleicher. So, ultimately, that's exactly what happens. Hindenburg and these wealthy industrialists in Germany kind of come together and they decide that Hitler will become the chancellor and the Nazis will be given some key cabinet positions. Frick will get the Minister of Interior, Göring will get the Minister of Interior in Prussia, but the other good golden positions, like the Minister of Defense, the Minister of Commerce, these positions will be occupied by a lot of these rich industrialists. So really Hitler is chosen because the industrialists and Hindenburg believe, and even Papen really believe, that Hitler can be manipulated. They believe that he's not going to be as powerful of a guy as he thinks of himself. Because Hitler and Goebbels and other Nazis, of course, they say that once they have power, the only way that they'll go out is if they are killed. So there's definitely the difference of opinion. These wealthy industrialists and Hindenburg don't really believe Hitler to be so powerful and dynamic, whereas Hitler himself believes once he's in power, he will hold it until he dies, which ultimately we see that to be true. And then there's that quote at the very bottom. It says, "The cardinal error of the Germans who opposed Nazism was their failure to unite against it." And that's definitely true, because again, if we look at the votes, we can see that the Nazis never have a complete majority. They're never able to totally rise to power purely through the legislative branch. When we see the elections in November of 1932, we can see that the Nazis take 196 seats. Not enough to get the majority. When we see the elections in July of 1932, again in the Reichstag, we see the Nazis have 230 seats, not 50%, not enough. And when we look at the presidential elections of March 1932 and April 1932, again, we can see that Hitler cannot get enough votes to make himself president. So at no point can Hitler purely rise to power through democratic means. He always needs to kind of do some of these backroom negotiations, these secret deals, in order to insert himself into the chancellorship. And ultimately, that's what he does. Ultimately, that's how he rises to power. Through purely legal means, kind of rising to fame, at first through the legislative branch, and then using these backroom negotiations at the executive level, really mostly with Hindenburg and Papen and these other people who were chancellor in the past, in order to insert himself into the chancellorship and can really have power, be in a position of power by January 30th, 1933. That is, of course, the date when Hitler becomes chancellor. So that's kind of all the details. They're very particular. They're very overwhelming. But the big picture are basically the key guys, which are Brüning, Papen, Schleicher, and Hitler. And we've got the key deal or key points that Hitler is never willing to compromise. He's never willing to accept a position less than the chancellorship, even though he's offered it. He absolutely demands the chancellorship, and ultimately he will get it. And we can also see that he's purely using legal means. rejecting his old philosophy of 1923 of the beer hall putsch in Munich. So, these are kind of the key deals. And, if on a test, many times in the past, almost always there's a test about a dictator's rise to power. Usually it involves a choice, so the students could choose Hitler, Perón, or Castro. Those are the ones that they're best prepared for at the school, the American school of Tegucigalpa. So, if mentioning that question, dealing with conditions and methods, and thinking about Hitler, you can see, a lot of that here. You can see the conditions being bore out by the actions of people that are not Hitler, the actions of Hindenburg, the actions of Schleicher, the actions of Brüning, and then, of course, the methods themselves would be really the use of the SA and the uncompromising attitude that Hitler has, and maybe also some of the colluding that Hitler does in order to rise to power at a few different points, because, of course, Hitler colludes with Schleicher in order to remove the ban on the SA in 1932, and then later on, Hitler colludes with Papen in 1933 in January in order to convince Hindenburg to give Hitler the chancellorship. So, a lot of details, a lot of stuff, but certainly this will help a lot more than purely the reading alone, and hopefully with this audio recording, it will be a lot easier to identify and extract quotations and evidence from the reading for any possible assignment that could appear. So, I hope it's helpful.